Hi, Anna.
Hey.
Yay. Okay, it's you. I thought there was someone. Just waiting for one more speaker, and we'll start as soon as he joins us.
Sure.
Sindhuja? Is that how you pronounce it? I'm sorry.
Sindhuja.
Sindhuja.
Yes.
I have a question. I asked my intern to join the event.
Okay.
To look at it. Can I just send her the link and you share the link with us?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, awesome.
Hi, Emma. Emanuele, we have joined us today. You made it. He was stuck somewhere in between Rotterdam and Antwerp and Belgium in Brussels, but you finally made it.
Yeah, exactly. It was more hectic than what I thought, but I made it on time. So
all right.
on time.
So we can start right now. I will so Emanuele, I have just posted the YouTube link to the meeting that is being shown over here. So feel free to share it within your network. We will be starting with you. So I would like to officially welcome all of you to this panel discussion on World Refugee Day. As the title suggests, World Refugee Day is about honoring and showing support to refugees, but most importantly, we believe that it is important to talk about the resilience and the courage and the perseverance and the strength that refugees have shown in the face of adversities. So that is why we chose the topic Rethinking Resilience and have a focus on it. We have 5 wonderful speakers, and all from different lines of expertise. We have a social psychologist, we have a mental health worker, we have a journalist and an activist, we have entrepreneurs and also an advocate from different organizations. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting day. Those of you who are joining us via YouTube, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment. And for those of you who are here, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them on the chat. I guess we can start right now. I will briefly introduce Emanuele. I'm sorry, I have to, he's a good friend of mine, but I will still have to read his bio from a little post. So Emanuele is a researcher at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at KU Leuven University. His research is mainly based on experiences of reception and integration among persons seeking international protection in Europe. His most recent studies focus on the role of social networks developed in reception contexts as a form of integration and personal development resource for asylum seekers in collective accommodation centers. So Emanuele, the digital floor is yours. Thank you again for joining us and welcome.
So thank you, Sindhu, for the kind introduction. I'm also very happy to meet you all and have the chance to hear what you're doing, your point of view, your perspective on the topic of today. I think perhaps I can start a little bit by rethinking, perhaps. I think rethinking is a good term. The term refugee itself, Refugee Day, it's of course is a symbolic events, but the term refugee is far from being consensual, or is far from being uniform in what he comprises. But also what it excludes. So I think, first of all, to think resilience, but also to think different adversities that people asking for international protection might face a little bit, giving the idea of the different legal statuses that might be hidden behind this term refugee, that is mainly a term used in public opinion, but then in reality, it only includes those people who were recognized international protection. And in the case of European systems, these only comprise a minority of people that have moved out or flee from their countries for push factors such as violence, war, conflict, but also famine and climate change, as many other topics. So the recognized refugees are only a minority, and a lot of adversities comes before the recognition of refugee status, and sometimes they will perdure also after arriving and settling down in European countries because of legal limitations. So in my case, in my research, I mainly work with, for instance, asylum seekers, meaning people that are still into the asylum procedure or in this kind of waiting periods in which it's very uncertain whether they will be appointed or not. Refugee status is uncertain, but there is a lot of information and knowledge that this refugee status also depend on the country where you comes from. Even after starting the procedure, certain people know that the chances they have to get the refugee status are very low. And this uncertainty, of course, creates a lot of problems in terms of life prospects and being able to project themselves in the future, which is one of the topic of our research, for instance, because we try to really approach with the people living in the centers this topic of future, and to see whether there is some goals and some aspirations that are able to develop even during this uncertainty period. And we also try to give some prospects and some hope in case of a negative result of the asylum procedure. But we do see that the impact of talking about positive or negative outcomes is very different, and approaching the topic of possible negative outcome of the asylum procedure is probably the most threatening element. And we try to work with social workers also in order to help them to find ways to approach this topic without threatening the existential self of the people, and trying to give viable ways to find a future even in an absence of a refugee status. That, as I say, for many people is very likely, much more likely than obtaining a refugee status in their life. So we are talking about people that might have moved from Belgium. I work in Belgium right now to Germany, from Germany to the Netherlands, from the Netherlands back to Belgium, to enter France, and then perhaps Switzerland. So these trajectories are far more fragmented. In search for a legal recognition, this often doesn't really happen for many years. So what we do and the way we approach it is also try to work from a social network perspective, as Sindhuja has mentioned, meaning that we try to raise awareness about the social contacts, the social support, people that are around, and those we interviews might have met in the past. Perhaps they still have the contacts, perhaps they still have the numbers, because social network, we know, can be a source of resilience. Talking about resilience. So resilience is not just a psychological traits that we have or we don't have, but it's most often in the social environment and the support we can count on. And this is valid for everyone, even more for those who have a very fragilized and fragmented life trajectory. So we work a lot on networks in order to develop together with the person during the interview their own network, to visualize it, to also play around with the people and the connection that exists among people, and then reflects on how they have met, which kind of support that might have from these people in case they need. And we see that this in itself is a very effective and powerful tool to empower those we interview, because sometimes we don't think or we don't reflect on how much support we might have around us. The first thing is we are alone. Loneliness is one of the biggest problems, but in reality, by working together with those with whom we partner, the participants we interviewed, we see that afterwards there is this energy that comes back also by knowing that, okay, I'm not alone. I can count on somebody. Even if tomorrow I'm in a difficult situation, I can contact this person and perhaps he can help me because I know that he passed through the similar situation. So perhaps he's somebody I can count on. And this is a resilience factor for us. And that's why I wanted to highlight, yes, the role of social networking, social support capital in try to navigate this life transition that are otherwise very threatening and very difficult to face. So that's what we are doing in collaboration with Red Cross, which is our organizational partners, because it's mandated to organize and to manage accommodation centers, and also in order to help social workers to develop their own protocols to approach perhaps this topic of social support and networks together with the people in order to anticipate the result of an asylum process that will most likely happen in the coming months, and in order to anticipate possible outcomes and prepare the person to reactivate in advance, let's say, these networks, not wait until the last moment to be outside the doors of the center, but to have already at least re-established certain contacts that might be then useful in the future. So voila, this is just in a nutshell what we are doing. And yeah.
Okay, wow, that was That was very, very informative and very concise. But I guess when we have more questions, we'll be delving a little bit more deeper into it. Next, we have Roy Hillel. So I will just briefly read out his bio. So Roy Shaul Hillel is a licensed clinical social worker, currently working as the mental health and psychosocial support director of the organization Humanity Crew. He specializes in psychotherapy with displaced children and youth who are survivors of sexual violence and has been working in the humanitarian field for over 8 years. In his work, he aims to focus on 3 main issues to create more comprehensive interventions: decolonization, intersectoral humanitarian work, and community building. And therefore, it is based on these factors that will help one create more holistic responses to humanitarian disasters. So thank you, Roy, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for that. Sorry that the paragraph was so long. So nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Roy. I'm a clinical social worker and I work as the mental health director of Humanity Crew. I'll just say a word about us. We're an organization that provides mental health interventions to refugees and displaced people all over the world. And we do that through community work. So we try to see on mental health as something that can come from the community, and we can add professional knowledge of expertise and mental health professionals, but still we're trying to focus on the capacities of the community in our interventions. We work in different places. We started by working in Greece with Syrian refugees. We are a Palestinian-Israeli organization, so we're based in Haifa. So most of the therapists that we have speak Arabic, so that's why we work in Lebanon. And now we're also working in Gaza, in Ukraine, and recently in Turkey. So also with displaced people. So I will say one thing about resilience, because I feel like it's a must. But I think resilience is used quite a lot, especially in the humanitarian field. The definition that I like of it is that it's defined as a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. And I think there's something about resilience, about adaptation that we usually look at. But I also think that the word resilience is sometimes being misused when we talk about psychology. I think that resilience comes from the thought that someone can protect themselves from what is happening in a way. And on one hand, there is the adaptation factor of it, and we as humans, we adapt to new situations. But on the other hand, I think when we talk about resilience, we need to see that we're not covering up any emotions that are rising because of a traumatic event. And what can rise, I think that's important. So first of all, when we're talking about mental health issues, what we see a lot among refugees is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is especially about a specific event that is happening throughout the process of displacement. It can be also a prolonging trauma, and it can be a couple of events that sort of create this experience of experiencing trauma. What we see a lot of as well is depression and anxiety. We see a lot of social anxiety among children and youth as well. But I think that these are all sort of the medical terms for it. I think what we actually see is a lot of sadness. And I think right now, our organization is working in Turkey with Syrian refugees who lived in southern Turkey, who fled from Syria, and then their houses were destroyed by the earthquake. I think what we see is some sort of a complex trauma. We see sort of this path of experiencing a lot of traumas, also intergenerationally, and how that affects the community. We see how it goes from generation to generation, and I think that's one of the toughest thing in communities of refugees, is this couple of generations of being either marginalized or going through oppression or going through violence. And that affects everything in the community. Yeah, please feel free to ask your questions. So I will talk a little bit about what we actually do, right? Because mental health is an issue, and we know that also for people who are not refugees. What do we do, for example, in a refugee camp? What do we do when people are displaced and they don't have these mental health services around them? So I think one of the main approaches that people talk about in the past couple of years is community-based mental health and psychosocial support. So when we talk about mental health, we talk more about diagnoses of mental health issues like depression, like anxiety, like PTSD. And when we talk about psychosocial, we talk about everything else. So we talk as well about gender-based violence, about domestic violence, about substance use, many different factors that affect refugees. And the way we do it, first of all, we try to work with the capacities of the community. So we start to see what is there in the community that is still being taken care of. For example, if it's a main faith, if there is a previous leader from the original home, if there are any structures or groups that already exist. For example, in many places, there's a group of men and a group of women who have different chores. And the fact that there is already a group means that we can work with the group to kind of understand what are the needs of the community and also what structures already exist so we can work on them. So if it means, for example, working with the parents on how to react to their children's behavior after the traumatic event. If we're talking about education and mental health, so implementing mental health services within the education services, and many more. I think one of the things that we see, at least, is the lack of structure the humanitarian fields have on mental health. I think when we talk about health, it's very clear. When we talk about logistics, about providing water and sanitation, there is something that I think is still more understandable on this need. And I think mental health is often being unseen by a lot of organizations. And also I'm thinking about countries, for example, that accept refugees to them. Do they actually provide a culturally sensitive mental health care? Do they provide it in their own language? Do they use, for example, local healers or local therapists from within the community to work with them? So this is very briefly like some of the issues that we deal with, I think, when there is a displacement. Yeah, I do invite people if anyone has a question. I don't know if people can write in the chat, but.
Right. So thank you so much, Roy, for that comprehensive outlook. So we will take the questions at the end of everyone's talks. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. And I think everyone will be more than happy to answer them. Next, we have, let me pull this out. Next, we have Marta Guerrero. And she is an advocate for Refugees International, an organization, and she focuses on expanding labor market access to refugees. Martha interned at the International Organization for Migration in Myanmar, and she worked in labor displacement and skills development programs. And she worked with female-led startups in Mexico City. And Martha also worked at the Organization of American States, where she helped create a public-private partnership to promote connectivity and education in the Americas. So Martha will be speaking a little bit more about the structural challenges to refugee gaining in independence and resilience. So Martha, please go ahead and we'll be happy to hear you.
Thank you, Sinduya, and thank you so much for the invitation. Happy World Refugee Day, and thank you everyone who's listening to this important discussion about how we are rethinking refugee resilience and the refugee response in the refugee space. My work focuses at Refugees International on labor market access. I lead on an initiative by Refugees International and the Center for Global Development, called the Let Them Work initiative, that seeks to expand access to the labor market and decent work right conditions to refugees around the world. And we do this through research and advocacy. And part of my research has been focusing on how do we understand what are the benefits of allowing refugees to work. And today we're here thinking about the topic of rethinking resilience. And I think this really connects very well to how do we really rethink our perceptions of refugees, and we rethink the global refugee humanitarian response. For years, the way that the humanitarian system works is on their care and maintenance. Basically, international donors, international organizations work with host countries to provide aid and support that is already very, very limited, that only allows for refugees to cover for only their basic needs, if sufficient. Basically, do you need water? Do you need food? Do you have shelter? And sometimes even the conditions where refugees live are not even decent for them to actually thrive and have a decent life. So in a way, this idea that refugees are burdens and therefore must be under this care and maintenance situation is flawed, right? And a lot of my research focus on how do we stop as the international community seeing refugees as burdens, but as an opportunity, as a responsibility, as an opportunity for host countries and their communities to grow and to improve. And evidence shows in so many contexts that refugees are agents of change in their communities and are economic agents that not only come with host countries with their skills and their knowledge, but they're also entrepreneurs. They open businesses, they hire locals, they come with skills, work in the economy, and allow host communities to thrive and nations to thrive as well. So in a way, rethinking resilience is rethinking this idea of refugees as burdens and see them as an opportunity, as an agents of change, and shifting those dynamics, not only in how we respond to the refugee situation, but what we allow refugees to do so that they can actually thrive and enjoy the same rights as any other locals can enjoy. So in a way, basically, a lot of the research on, and I like the topic that is about resilience, because what does resilience mean? We think about resilience in terms of the ability to cover for basic needs, but I think it's a little bit beyond that. It's not only the ability to cover the basic needs, but it's also what resources do I have to be able to cover those needs, and also how do I go beyond that? If those resources are not available because, for instance, I lose my job, do I have access to other safety nets to ensure that I am not thrown into poverty and in bad conditions? And I think in a way, I also like to think of resilience beyond basic needs. I like to think of resilience about giving refugees and their families the opportunity to thrive. And in a way, my research highly focused on economic inclusion and labor market access, which is the ability that we define as the ability of refugees of working in professions or jobs that match their skills and knowledge. So for instance, if you are a doctor that happen to be displaced, that you can work in your profession in the place that you're hosted, or if you were a teacher, or if you were an artisan highly specialized on, I don't know, some other type of skill, like that you are able to use those skills and really implement it in the host country's economy. I want to mention that for context, more than 85% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, where these countries also experience a lot of development issues themselves. So in a way, when we have situations where even the locals sometimes face some sort of poverty rates, high poverty rates, informality rates, exploitation and abuse, we see those conditions even more for refugees. even more exacerbated for refugees. And I think that is part of the response, that we also need to ensure that we can decrease those specific vulnerabilities that refugees face in joining the economy and the labor market and being able to thrive in their local communities. And we see this in two ways. One of them is the policy aspect, and the other is the practical aspect. In the policy aspect, one very important precondition for refugees to be able to work is, first of all, regularization. Do host countries acknowledge refugee status? Do they give them permits and regular status that allow them to actually be in that country without the fear of being persecuted, detained, or expelled, or then harassed by authorities because of their immigration status or lack thereof? So in a way, that is a very important precondition for resilience as a whole. Have the safety to know that you can really be safe and stay and thrive in the place where you fled and you're seeking protection. The second aspect is obviously the legal framework under which refugees live. So for instance, the situation of urban refugees or refugees in camp can be very different. For refugees in camp, there is issues as freedom of mobility. Maybe they cannot go search for jobs outside the camps. Are they even allowed to work within the camps? And for instance, in some countries like Bangladesh, even camp work is extremely, it's not allowed, and they bulldoze shops and every other type of micro entrepreneurship that they might have to survive. In others, there might be some special permits that allow refugees to leave the camps to search for work, but to get those permits is extremely difficult, and most refugees really cannot access to them. So in some others, there's informality where refugees tend to work in that informal sector as they cannot really join the formal sector. And for urban refugees, the situation might be a little bit different. Maybe they have the freedom of mobility, but at the same time, they might not have the security to be able to afford for their housing and afford their basic needs to really allow them to look for jobs in the places where they might be, they're skilled to look for jobs. A lot of my research focused on Colombia and Peru, and talking with businesses and entrepreneurs that hire refugees, I will ask them, what are the main barriers that you face when you were trying to hire forcibly displaced Venezuelans? And one of the first things that they said was like, oh, sometimes they don't make it to the interview. And when we were talking with people implementing programs there, they will say, yeah, because for them, the $1 that costs for the bus or the transport to get to the interview is already a full day of work, or a day that they won't work, plus they will have to feed their family. It's just too much money for them to that they cannot afford to make that even the smallest thing as just getting transport to the location where the interview will take place. So there's a lot of programs. Like one of my favorite is called the graduation approach. And in some of these programs, they give refugees even like the smallest details, from like the clothes that you will wear to the interviews, to helping you prepare your resume, to helping you get transport and the money for the day that you will go to potentially get a job. So it's also, we don't only have to think of the policy. Yes, maybe they are allowed to work, but what happens after that? What are the specific vulnerabilities that they face that don't allow them to actually get those jobs? And from the host community, there might be also other types of issues, like for instance, like xenophobia and discrimination might be a big problem in many host communities. Identity issues of, especially for instance, like, are women allowed to work in those contexts? Is it a cultural thing that might prevent women from accessing work? For LGBTQ plus communities, their sexual or gender identity, does this affect them in the way when they are trying to get a job? I also want to mention very briefly, and I know I'm going through a lot of topics, but I think it's very important because when we think of resilience, we really need to think also about jobs, right? Like, how do we allow refugees to work? And, if you see all the interviews with like refugees, when they do consultations about what are your needs, what are your priorities, on the top 3, you will always consistently see, I want to work, I want employment, I want to earn an income, because this is a very important aspect of survival, of life, but also I think maybe I would love to hear from our other panels of mental health, to be able to integrate into your host country and do what you were always meant to do and not feel like put on the side with jobs that do not match your qualifications, suffering from exploitation, from abuse at the workplace. In talking about this, I also want to talk about informality. As I originally mentioned, most refugees live in developing countries where informality rates tend to be higher. So in a way, informality, it's like a double-edged sword. On one side, it allows for refugees to get employment, especially on the practical side when the legislation doesn't allow for employment. And it provides like a little bit of a panacea on resources. Like, okay, maybe that's the only solution I have. On the other side, there might be high levels of exploitation, abuse, and many other things that that you can find, especially in these markets that are not regulated. So I think when we think of jobs, and especially on the decent job side, is how do you actually also ensure that decent work conditions and resources are given to refugees, even if they are in informality, and those that are in informality that maybe have a profession that wouldn't normally be working in that sector according to maybe the labor market economy, that you allow them to jump to work in the sectors that they're meant to work, where they're skilled to work. Part of my research as well in Colombia, for instance, is not only about giving to refugees, but it's also what they give back to society. And one of the things we found, for instance, in the case of Colombia, is that if Colombia were to allow Venezuelans to be included in the economy the same as Colombians, with the same type of barriers that maybe a local Colombian will face, the GDP will grow basically $1 billion every year. So it's also a win-win situation for host countries that makes sense not only on the rights side, on the humanitarian side, on the protection side, but it also makes sense on the development side. Not only you increase the conditions and allow refugees and their families to thrive, but you also allow host communities and the country to really grow and develop. And I think that's why I started I started speaking by saying we need to rethink the system as well, moving from humanitarian response that focus on care and maintenance to a humanitarian development approach that acknowledges the very big contributions that refugees give to their host countries, throughout the years. So with that, I'm very happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you so much, Martha, for that. I think you've given us a very comprehensive outlook of the challenges to refugee resilience and the focuses that we need to be making. Again, I would like to remind people, including our panelists, if you have any questions for each other, please feel free. We'll be more than happy to start a nice discussion with everyone. Our next speaker is Ania Albot. So Ania is a Polish journalist and a political activist. Ania's has gained her international attention as the initiator of Civil March for Aleppo. And she co-initiated Grupa Granica. It's a group of Polish human rights organizations that take care of refugees on the Polish-Belarusian border. She's also the media officer of Minority Rights Group International, and she has been awarded the Amnesty International Human Rights Defender Award in 2017. So there is a lot more to talk about Anna, but maybe we will, you can read that on our Instagram post, but I would like to give Anna the floor and yeah, let's continue this discussion.
Sinducha, thanks for inviting me here. I'm you gathered such a group of people. Very, very nice to meet you, everybody, and to listen to you. It's a beautiful exchange. I already learned a lot from all of you. And well, I was thinking to be a bit more personal here, to tell you a bit more about my path through the migration route and my learnings and my refugee teachers in all of this, because I feel that I'm constantly a student in this school run by the Masters of Resilience and Strength and Flexibility, and creativity. I have a privilege to work on the topic of migration for many years already. I think the first people I was learning from, it was 20 years ago in a Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights in Poland. I'm Polish myself. I'm based in Berlin, but I'm Polish. Those were the times when 90,000 Chechens came to Poland, and those were still the times when it was not a political tool to be used. So it was not a problem. It was not a problem that 90,000 people of different religion and background arrived to my country. And I will never forget those first meetings. I'm a bit older than I look like, but I was still a young person, meeting people who went through so many different phases of life, and I had no idea how they managed this. I remember the first night when I came back home, and I was telling my parents about all what they told me, and I just couldn't, comprehend all of it. Well, for many years afterwards, I couldn't really decide if I'm more an activist organizing things, or I'm a journalist. I was publishing human rights stories in this last 20 years of life. I was traveling a lot, and somehow I always ended up somewhere in the world in the refugee camp, because this was what was the most interesting for me. And then in 2015, when so many Syrians arrived to Berlin, where I live, I think that was the moment when my life really changed completely and turned into migration full time. That was the time when, together with my husband and kids, we decided to give space in our flat to Syrian refugees. And it hasn't stopped. I guess there is no week where we don't have visitors. Some of the Syrians at that time stayed with us for 2 years. Some people are just coming and going. And Sinducha, you mentioned my work on the Polish-Belarusian border. This is now the main source of guests in my house when people manage to get to Germany, to calm down and to eat and to sleep before applying for asylum. They can stay here. Everybody welcome, by the way. You can always contact me. I'm here for you. When we were hosting Syrians in 2015, that was a time when war in Syria was touching me more than anything else, because the war in Syria was suddenly not something far away, but it was something happening in my kitchen on the calls of my new flatmates. And the siege of Aleppo was just a very, very strong, very important happening for me. And that was the time when I initiated Civil March for Aleppo. It was a demonstration. We were going from Berlin to Syrian border for 8 months. A lot of Syrians joined us. Altogether, 4,000 people joined us. But from the beginning, already in Berlin during the organization meetings, and then within all the countries we were passing by, there were a lot of Syrian refugees with us. And for me, learning from them, their perspective and then their strategy on this international advocacy, on how to approach different topics, how to approach the topic of conflict, how to approach the topic of peace building. It was a big, extremely valuable lesson. For the last 6 years, when I'm not in Berlin, I'm on different European borders. In the organization I'm working for, Minority Rights Group International, I run different projects for journalists. I have well, pleasure is a bad word, a privilege to bring groups of journalists to the locations where people are arriving to Europe, and also to countries in Africa and Middle East where people are coming from. I very much believe in this one-to-one meetings, meetings on the ground, exchange, and having a wider, bigger picture of the situation, not only seeing people arriving, but also understanding drivers of migration and well, a bigger picture. So I visited most of the camps in Europe. I've been to, I guess, all of the European borders where the migration paths are coming. I have a lot of friends in many of the squads and many of the camps on the borders of Europe. And you know, sometimes I'm trying to reflect and think, why do I work in this topic? Why do I work during days and during nights on these topics? Is it because those people are in difficult situation and I want to help them? Or maybe it's rather because those are the people I can learn from so much. In Minority Rights Group, in the organization I'm working for, we like to say that we don't want to be the megaphones of minorities and refugees, but we rather would like to be the sound engineers who can adjust this fucked up sound system of this world, that those voices are heard, that it's not us talking, but it's them talking, and sharing their experiences, but also their strengths and all what we can learn from them. You know, those are voices of experienced travelers, of fighters, of activists, of masters of flexibility. I just now when I think just, you know, about people I met or people I used to work with, Parvana Amiri, who was yesterday, Sinducha, you were hosting another webinar. She was one of your speakers, is a good friend of mine, a young girl from Afghanistan who, sitting in the tent in Moria camp on Lesbos, learned German. I'm in Germany since 15 years. You don't want to hear me speaking German. You know, when somebody has such a strength to learn and to fight for well, your own education, this is something that we don't only should appreciate, but also learn from it. With Parvana, when she was moved to Ritsona camp in Greece, she decided she wants to run school, because it's not only her who wants to learn German and English and all the other languages, but she didn't have place for it. So I was thinking how I can support it, and the group of journalists I was bringing to Greece at that time, we smuggled some information about gathering donations at the end of every article. So we managed to get money and to build the school in the Ritsona camp, where Parvana, after doing online course on how to run school, she was running a school. And you know, this is just I sometimes can't believe where people like Parvana get their strength from. How does it work? I know a lot of mothers on the borders of Europe. I'm a mother myself. I struggle with, you know, annoying kids sometimes. And I remember during COVID lockdown, when we were all stuck at home and I was stuck at home with my annoying kids, I was calling my refugee friends in the camps, asking like, how do you deal with those kids in the tent all the time? You know this, you are used to this. Tell me how to do it. So refugee parents, another big chunk of inspiration for me. Then there is another group I'm learning from, which are refugee journalists and photographers, people who used to work as journalists before, or they decided that this is what they want to do. I'm very often consulting with them. how to cover topics of migration, how to cover topics of minorities, how to approach people in the communities. This is what they do daily. Whenever I organize roundtable for, big publishers or editors-in-chief of different media outlets in the world on covering migration, I first thing that I'm doing is I'm inviting the refugee journalists who can share how to do it in the best way, because they know the best. And then there is still a group of all those active refugees, activists or politicians or future politicians, people who just feel they want to give to society much more than others. And this is something that I'm observing a lot on the Polish-Belarusian border, when people manage to cross this border after difficult times, once they are safe, once they have place to stay in a refugee camp in Germany or in France. The first thing they do, they call me and they ask me how they can support our activities. And I have a lot of people who translate for us in the moment we need translation in the forest, because people crossing those borders, they are coming from, I think right now we have in the statistics 50 countries. So of course it's impossible for us to speak all those languages. But I have this network now between the people who crossed before. They want to be available for us 24/7. And whenever I need some, weirdest version of any language, I have somebody to call. They want to be involved. They want to take part in activities I'm organizing. And I'm sometimes thinking, like, don't you want to forget about what you went through? Don't you want to start your life and not think about all of these things? Don't take part in all these webinars we are discussing, as you were saying, yes, the mental health, the labor market, all these challenges that are out there. But so many of them want to, and this is always so impressive for me. And when it comes to reporting on migration, this is this big topic I'm covering, training journalists and bringing them to the places and consulting a bit how to do it. And what you, Marta, said before about this narration of refugees are a problem. Yes, like this is a problem. This narration that refugees are a problem is a problem. That's what it is, because refugees can be solution, might be solution, can help with finding solutions. This is something which is in a very seldom situations tackled. Yes, we made in MRG, we made some research about covering migration and stories on migration 2 to 3 years ago. And it showed that I think 72% of stories on migrations are written without the quote, without words of refugees and migrants. And they know the best in which situation they are and what they need. And asking some, young activists on the border, what do refugees need? Like, how can we do that? I just sometimes I just can't believe that it's happening. So for me, a lot of solutions, a lot of answers to questions that we all have, because it's normal, we all have questions, lay between the voices of refugees. And today on the World Refugee Day, I was thinking in the morning about this day, and what it means for me. And I was thinking about how many things I'm grateful for, how many things I learned in these last years. And I made a little list. So for the end of my speech, I can read you things that I would like to thank for. So I would like to thank for setting an example for me and the rest of the world in how to remain strong in crisis. For your commitment to carry on despite the challenges, for your courage and determination to rebuild your lives, for teaching me resilience, patience, and strength. This we already had before. For showing me that life without freedom is possible, sad and hard, but possible. For helping me to identify what I understand by European values. For teaching me how to live in uncertainty. For proving that living without answers to when and where is possible. For showing me what real family bonds are. For sharing your creativity and talents, paintings, poems, songs. I mean, sometimes I'm just blown away with this. For standing our European selfishness, borders, and inhuman treatment and not fighting for revenge. For impressing me with strength of kids and young men. That's a group that I really admire so much. For teaching me how to ask for help. And for teaching me how to stay kind and supportive to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that very personal speech of yours. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you, and I think the points that you just pointed out is something that we can all resonate with. I'd like to introduce our final speaker for the panel, and then we open the floor for some discussion. It's Heidi Afi from Bees and Refugees. She's the Director of Development. She's a Syrian American living in London. She holds a master's in human rights and politics with the international experience in refugee advocacy, social enterprises, and social research. So Heidi, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing you speak about your work with Bees and Refugees.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the incredible speakers who have gone before me. I feel really reinvigorated and inspired hearing all of the expertise and passion that you all bring here today. Feeling very excited by the space that we're able to share together here today. So I guess I'll start with a little bit to talk about what Bees and Refugees is, besides a very catchy and rhyming title that the CEO and founder put together a few years ago. We were founded in late 2019 by a Syrian activist named Ali Al-Zain, who is living in the UK on a humanitarian basis after fleeing from the destruction caused by the Syrian regime's war on the people. And he found, after spending some years volunteering and working with refugees himself, while also working in different industries in London, that his mental health was severely affected by his experiences as a migrant and within the oppression by the regime, as well as returning to volunteer and work within refugee camps. He had compounded layers of PTSD and other mental health struggles because of his experiences. And upon recommendation from his late grandfather, who was a beekeeper in Syria, Ali began keeping his own bees. He often jokes that he was thinking about getting a cat, but instead thought of something a little bit less traditional. And very quickly, he found that the connection that he had with the bees helped with his mental health issues almost immediately. He tells very heartwarming stories about how he started spending every morning having breakfast out by the bees in his garden, and things started to dramatically change. And as soon as it was possible for him, he quit his job in the other industry he was working in London's fashion industry, and founded Bees and Refugees to be able to share the immediate and very impactful relationship he had with beekeeping and the bees with other migrants, asylum seekers, and marginalized communities within London. And we've been going for a couple of years now and have had actually quite a great impact in our community and are very excited to keep going. And we found that resilience is multifaceted, and in particular, we find it quite connected, the relationship between the resilience of species on this earth, especially endangered species, and that of communities that are facing constant threats, be it that which forces them into unwanted migration or forced migration from a large reason of causes, depending on where they're originating from, and as well as the threats in integrating into new homes, whether it's the lack of social support, the lack of governmental support, the difficulties in integrating into a new place, with, as everyone has really covered here, the difficulties that they face on a daily basis into being accustomed into a new space, let alone the mental health stress that comes with everything aforementioned. So we integrate, we kind of intervene as a supplementary support to the mental health being provided and the other kind of social supports being provided, but one that is programming that allows or fosters resilience through the relationships being built between refugees and their local communities through the act of beekeeping itself. But another key thing is the skills and the therapy of beekeeping itself. One that people don't really think of or don't really see, it's not something that's very clear, is that beekeeping itself is an occupational therapy as well as a somatic therapy. The act of approaching a beehive requires a great regulation of one's breath and mood, and a really like a check-in with oneself that requires a kind of focus that is not common on a day-to-day basis. So in that sense, it requires a deep understanding of oneself and a calmness. In the act of beekeeping itself and being around thousands of buzzing little creatures, ones that we often see as, a threat, something that could sting us or cause us harm. It requires a severe humility, and not in humility in a way that, we put ourselves as lesser, but you're staring at something quite larger than yourself, and you're responsible for the wellness of little creatures that obviously can cause some harm, but causes a beautiful reciprocity and an autonomy and a relational respect between the bees and oneself, that creates an ambiance and an environment of, like I said, occupational and somatic therapy, but also calmness, like a complete sereneness that is often devoid in the lives of many asylum seekers and refugees on a day-to-day basis. And often beekeeping is seen as something kind of niche or done with one's time, if they have the finances or ability to do so. And we are the first organization really, or one of the first, at least in London, that is working particularly for refugees and asylum seekers and marginalized communities to make these things accessible and free, and to really target our programming for those who are struggling with mental health issues, with PTSD, with trauma, and adverse impacts on their lives. And the impacts of this are very clear, and they're very, very wonderful. We have people who are so excited for our programming to return. Often, as we have been speaking about here, there are a litany of reasons that there are mental health struggles and material struggles that refugees face, often not accessing past entrepreneurship, for example, or like we've been really reiterating here, the lack of government support or pathways into integration in one society. But often the activities or opportunities available for folks and for these communities to be able to feel less isolated is incredibly important. So our programming focuses a lot on combating social isolation and building community through a focused and shared activity. In all of that, especially with the programming, we aim to have the folks from these backgrounds work within their local communities. So a strong emphasis on not only building community within the refugee community, but also with local communities and those who are originally from the UK. But really thinking about as well, and this is a bit of the alternative part of it, as the bees as part of that social network, as well as the earth itself. So not only linking people to each other, but really helping facilitate that connection back to the earth. And something we really like to emphasize within our work is that oftentimes people who are forced from their homes or for enforced migration scenarios usually have a better connection to their surroundings, their ecosystems, and the earth and their land than those within hosting Western countries, for example, or at least is definitely the case within the UK's context. And we are trying our hardest to be able to offer space and specifically create space for migrants, refugees, and marginalized people to connect on a land that is meaningful and it has great ancestral roots for them as well. So we are emphasizing, and really was what Emmanuel was speaking and felt very resonant with us in terms of reiterating and helping people recognize their social networks. And we do that not only by emphasizing our social networks through the act of beekeeping and gathering community, both local and refugee, but as well connecting with the earth and our ecosystems as a critical point of resilience, both for one's mental health and thinking about the future in positive terms and building skills, but also in terms of the same mechanisms that are causing forced migration and creating difficulties at borders and creating long-term mental health issues are by and large the same fundamental mechanisms that are causing the destruction of the earth and forcing bees and other species into endangered and dangerous positions. So we connect those issues together and offer a space for the bees and for migrant, refugee, and marginalized communities to work together as a solution. And we understand the scope of our organization is quite small. We're really in our infancy, but we've been working hard to both advocate for that, but make a meaningful impact on our communities in terms of building that deep local connection, which can bring generational impacts, really, to have people connect with their homes in a meaningful sense. I was speaking to Ali before this and really reflecting on how resilience shows up in our work. And he was how much bees have faced threats over thousands of years, but they continue to be evolving and fighting back and creating pathways for their own resilience and their change. In a lot of ways, the way the speakers today have really highlighted the ways in which we can identify pathways for active resilience and creativity and recognizing what is being put up against people and working not with it perhaps, but working in ways that extend one's lives and I guess it's thrive despite what is being put in front of them. And that way the bees are inspiring through their working communally. If you really study how they operate and exist together and continue to sustain most of the pollination in this world, or a significant portion of it, folks are encouraged to think about how they can also, within their own communities, within their own families, and as they establish themselves into a new home, often as a choice that they would not rather have to do, be able to foster a similar kind of strength within community and within each other. It's incredibly important. And something that is a key part of how we really frame our work and would like to continue both advocating as well as, I mean, it's a big focus really on the advocacy and education through even our title and the work that we do is challenging the idea. I'm sure that we are all in this space, at least in agreement, about how migration is a natural and normal and beautiful thing. Obviously not forced migration due to terrible contexts. It's ones that we are often working in, but migration of animals and species has been a key part of evolution on this earth and how we've gotten to this place. It has also been a key part of how humanity has gotten into its beautiful, wide range of cultures and education and everything that we know and appreciate. And the fact that we're limiting it through such violent rules and borders has such a significant impact on all species and especially and including human species. And when we do not see that, and we're only willing to be able to see the fact that borders and a limitation of migration affects species quite significantly, and not piece together that it's not just humans that are suffering, or not only species or animals that are suffering, but it's all of us under this regime of border violence and a complete denial of necessary and that just migration is a key part of this earth and has always been, that we are continuing to suffer and cause adverse impacts in a plethora of ways to the communities living on this earth. So it's a key part of our advocacy and really drawing attention and not equalizing, obviously, the things that are causing bees to be endangered or the negative impacts or circumstances that face forced migration and refugees, or the struggles they may face in their new homelands, but connecting the fact that the power dynamics causing such things are really related and solutions against them, or at least to mitigate the impacts, like we're talking about through resilience, are also incredibly connected. What we really believe is that it's not just resilience because everyone deserves the most dignified life possible and a life that is with the least amount of traumas as possible, but also because the causes of these struggles should not be occurring. And we'd like to bring as much attention and advocacy and work in that direction as absolutely possible. Thank you. I could keep speaking on this for hours and hours, but I might get into the details of bees.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I think that was as you mentioned, it's a really fun name, but I think there's a beautiful analogy between what you do with bees, or how bees are seen as creatures that we need to work towards well, making sure that they don't go extinct, versus the fact that refugees also need that support. And I think that's a very beautiful analogy you've made. I'm going to open the floor to some questions. I think Emanuele already has one, but maybe first we can go with the first question that was asked, which is basically something about to Roy, what does a person suffering from PTSD need most?
I think it really depends on the person. I would say that the main thing that usually we do is working with the family in the immediate sense. So we provide psychoeducation on PTSD. We do diagnosis, and then we start referring to different services. So if it's a mental health therapist or a psychiatrist. But I would say that the main thing is the closest community. So the family, friends, neighbors, I think to break the shame out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone spoke about the importance of community and social inclusion. So integration definitely plays a huge role in not only about gaining resilience, but also one's mental health and social, the outlook of life. I believe Emanuele has a question. Emanuele, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for all the speeches and the different perspectives. I also share the same thought. I'm learning a lot, and it's nice to participate in these debates because it gives us also the possibility to open our breadth of perspectives as compared to what we normally work. And so thank you very much, everyone. It's not a question, it's more a reflection that popped up in my mind when Anna was talking, but that's also related to Marta, which is perhaps one word that we didn't mention yet, and it, funny enough, it sounds similar to resilience, is resistance, which is, I think, an important part of a resilient process. Which is related to claiming rights, trying to change policies that are generally very hostile in terms of access to rights, labor markets, as well as border policies, etc. And so the role of activists and activism in which refugee population are an important part and can participate on an equal footing, or at least this is the idea often behind activist movements, is not to be the megaphone, but perhaps the fine-tuner, as Anna was saying, of refugee voices, somehow the structure in which these voices can be heard. I do believe that they play an important role, at least in the European context, I would say, to bypass or complement policies and lack from policymaker of willingness to change the structural barriers that Marta was talking about. And so somehow resilience and political activism goes also together. Just to share a little anecdote, and then I see that Marta want to react. Yesterday was really yesterday that I came together with a representation of asylum seekers that are excluded from the reception system in Belgium. There is a huge housing crisis and a crisis in the accommodation system. So there are many asylum seekers that are officially registered and they should have the right to have a shelter. They don't have it because there is not much space. And so together with a representative of asylum seekers and a movement that is clustering behind, we went all together to the Secretary of Interior and Asylum and Migration in Brussels to give a letter, with an open letter with written inside all the possible statements about what we were asking to the ministry in order to solve this housing crisis for asylum seekers. And although purely symbolic, but three representatives of this group, one Afghan, one from Palestine, and one from Rwanda. They were able to enter in the office and discuss briefly with the Secretary of State of Migration in order to have a moments of let's say recognition of their claims. And right after the you should have been there, because the feeling of everybody was so empowering, and in that moment resilience was actually happening on spot. And so I do just want to say that sometimes to bypass these structural barriers is not enough to just wait for policymakers to do something in such a historical period in particular, but activism and participation in social movement can be an important part of resilience of people that otherwise don't have voice, or they are not given enough voice to claim their rights. Thanks.
Martha, let's start with you. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to actually, I'm very thankful, Emanuele, that you brought this up, because I think there is an important component of perceptions, policy, and evidence. If our politicians create policies based on what is popular, like, do we go with the tendency of scapegoating our policies and blaming refugees and immigrants for all of the pain and policy failures that you see in a country, then we will continue to see these types of xenophobic policies that like the othering of refugees, them versus us. But I think there is an important aspect of why producing evidence on the facts that happen is so important, because then we can go with like policymakers, we can go with the communities and be like, hey, this is actually what they are telling you, that they are taking away your jobs, that they are committing crimes, that refugees are here to rape your children and destroy your values and etc. Like all of these xenophobic narratives that we persistently see in so many host nations, we think we need to counteract them with facts. And I think there's an aspect of really observing, and us as communities, as activists, as organizations, but also governments need to really start observing like what are the discussions like happening, and what are the things that are fostering like those xenophobic sparks and xenophobic discussions at the host country level. And one of the things might be the same that, for instance, like in programs, when organizations implement programs to support refugees, a lot of those programs have components that include the host population. So there's this not othering, that they know that refugees are here to add for everyone. Like it's a pie that is like, it just gets expanded, it's not divided. So in a way, I think having those discussions, using evidence, using facts to counter xenophobic ideals and xenophobic discourses is very important. But I also want to link to something that Anna said, which is the weaponization of displacement and of refugees. I think we definitely are increasingly seeing the case of Belarus was a very clear one of like how refugees are increasingly used as pawns for some political factions to destabilize policies and some host nations, especially we see it happening in Europe. And I think in a way, it's our role and the policymakers to really differentiate kind of like, okay, like we have this situation, but we're not going to fall under these false narratives of, criminalizing refugees that are recriminalizing and re-traumatizing these people that are already, suffering. So I think we need to counter that with actually facts, and evidence does show that refugees are there to add. There's a lot of evidence, so we just need to continue producing it and convincing it. And one of our peers here at Refugees International, we have this initiative called the Refugee Lab, and they were releasing a statistics today that said like of any person that whenever they meet a refugee, their perception shifts 50% towards like favorable towards refugees, whereas like maybe in the past it was negative. So being able to interact themselves with refugees can change communities, can change the fabric of a country and the political fabric as well. And I think like that's also very important that as we work in this space, that we ensure that there's integration and this community building as well.
Yes, thank you, Martha. I think there's been considerable research on the aspect of contact with people, with outgroup members, that will increase inclusion and that will reduce prejudice. So that's absolutely needed. So it's not just about you come to a new country and I'll give you the facilities to learn a new language. You have to find a way to make the host citizens and refugees come together. I think Maria has a question. Maria, would you like to go for it? Yeah.
Hi, hi, my name is Maria, I use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to ask about communities. I think it will follow a little bit on the previous speakers. So what I often hear about is refugees joining the local communities, which I live in Scotland. We have a Reset program here, which is a program linked to allowing refugees to gain legal means to live in this country through community, through kind of community adoption of families. And what I feel very often is mentioned is that's how important it is for the refugees or asylum seekers to integrate with the communities. And that's also something that I hear quite often in Poland, where I'm from. And but what I heard about here is reusing resources that refugees already have. So doctors, their psychologists, interpreters. So I think my question is, how do you approach? Because I can see that there are speakers from many different organizations. How do you approach both the integration thing, but also refugees being supported in their local community? So those kind of, for example, communities of people coming from, let's say, Afghanistan or Syria in one place, they have similar culture. Obviously, they will stick together in a way, being in a new country. And that's definitely a really important thing. That's a value, that's an asset. But also another asset is, integrating with the local community and building new connections. So how do you link all of that?
Who's this question for, Maria?
Well, since there's many speakers here, I think I would like to hear from whoever wants to answer this question.
Okay, so whoever wants to answer this question first, please. Heidi, I guess you want to answer. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't speak to the full breadth of integration. I mean, that's a very well positioned question. And I can't speak or cast on too many things, but I can speak within our context. I think it's important to also really emphasize that it's not separate necessarily within one's own community from where they are originating from, not versus, but or separate from the local community or the community that they're integrating into. But I also think it's quite beautiful, the idea that as as Roy was saying earlier, in terms of community connections and destigmatizing or breaking down shame as a way to deal with PTSD. We are working with a wonderful organization in West London where we're hosting workshops between different organizations, but as well, one of the organizations has refugees from different backgrounds who are gathering on weekly basis or daily basis really for their own programming, but also joining together within the context of beekeeping. And they're all learning English at different paces, obviously, but they're working together from a variety of different backgrounds, pardon me, a lot of Iranian folk, Afghani folk, folks from Central America, a lot of Syrians, Iraqis, there's people from the Ethiopian folks, so people from a lot of different backgrounds who are working together in this particular context. So they are forging new community, and they're of course doing it in different ways within the host country community as well, but also amongst each other in a way that's also very fulfilling and meaningful, because they're meeting people from different places, but a similar, the thing unifying them being forced migration or finding space within the UK as their home country. So that also being a very helpful space for them to build community and build and forge new connections with folks who are different enough for themselves, but similar enough as well, for that being a very good stepping stone for that kind of community facilitation. And I hope that is something that is meaningful. And while I have the mic for just a moment, I would like to respond to what Martha was saying earlier about reframing media, a lot of media, but other narratives against what is being, framed as migrants in so many ways. One of the ways that we have found is really necessary and important is talking about how refugees in our context are really genuinely benefiting the UK or British ecosystem, especially our local ecosystems, by acting together on climate change, on forest and space degradation and whatnot through the practice of beekeeping. We have such a powerful impact on our local community and on our local ecosystem. And that has been such a powerful narrative shift, and we're pushing it as much as we can. And finding ways to highlight those kind of stories is incredibly important, because like you said, there are a plethora of ways that every day refugees and migrants are benefiting their host communities unimaginably and in such beautiful ways, and really putting focus on ways that we can respond, especially through the environment, I think is a very important way, because it's something that impacts us all very negatively, the way the environment and the climate has been affecting us, and being able to bring, really not just bring, but highlight the ways in which migrants and refugees can be a critical point of response to climate change, which is often a partial reason that people are in forced migration. So that's a way we've been counteracting the narratives about refugees in the UK, at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. There's a question from Martha to Anya. So I think it's, so can you think of ways in which your work with refugees has impacted your own resilience and outlook on life in general?
Gosh, it's impacting me constantly. I don't have one answer to this. It's one big lesson, and also one big lesson of what helps and what doesn't help. Still linking to what Heidi and Marta were saying about the integration, or I really don't like this word. I don't like to use this even. Living together, there are reasons why refugee camps are being put far away from cities, from villages. This is from every research you can find out there. We know that this is against the integration. Yes, we know what works. We know what doesn't work. I can bring the example of the Polish-Belarusian border and Polish-Ukrainian border. There is a reason why for 10 months there was a so-called emergency zone introduced along border with Belarus. It was not only about activists or humanitarian organizations not being able to help people there. It was also about removing the image, removing faces, and this contact one-to-one from the public space. Yes, it was the only place in European Union when journalists couldn't do their job. And then when we think about Ukrainian border, completely opposite situation. Every Polish citizen could sit in the car, drive to the border, invite a refugee to his car, share the soup, invite him home. And then we will be talking that Ukrainian refugees are integrating better, yes? They have freedom of movement. They could go to any place in Europe they wanted. It's so obvious that if you go to the place where there is your family or your friends, your beginning will be easier. Your start will be easier. You will be better off. Of course, it can be used. And here, Marta, I agree very much with you about this evidence and about talking about it by random citizens. Yes, we might be not politicians who might take decisions, but politicians will not care about the topic if their voters don't care about the topic. And their voters don't care about the topic if they don't know about the topic. And they don't know about the topic if we, all of us, don't talk during events like this, but also with the kids, with people who don't have this privilege as I have to meet people. I very, very much believe in this, building this bridge for meetings in any form possible.
Thank you, Anna. Emanuele, I guess you have another question, comment?
It was to answer Maria's comment following from Anna, just a little bit about integration and this torn topic and word of integration. Just to touch 2 points and perhaps try to deconstruct 2 false myths and discourses behind integration. On one hand, the idea of incompatibility of cultures, meaning that someone gets come from far away as to adopt our way of life and reduce the gap in values and lifestyles in order to integrate. So somehow this idea of incompatibility, and there is tons of research that show how people can incorporate different identities and facets, and the importance of maintaining contacts and relation with one's own community, and as well as transnational connections back home as a very important factor that promotes adjustment and resilience and well-being. So on one hand, the importance to maintain connection is part of an integration process. And the second, and what Anna was saying, that integration is first and foremost a responsibility of the hosting society. So integration can only happen if receiving society open their arms and they leave or give space of inclusion and acceptance of the other in order to integrate. So these 2 things, often if you look at the media or political speech, they are completely absent. And there are 2 fundamental elements without which integration becomes just an empty word or a rhetorical word used for political purposes, and actually means assimilate. The only way is to become like us, or otherwise we don't want you. So yeah, just little points there.
Yeah, I think that's a very important distinction between integration and assimilation. Well, when the expectation is to assimilate, and that's probably, Anya, maybe that's why you have some strange associations with the word integration. But yeah, I mean, you don't, I think this goes beyond refugees. This is also with migrants. You can't expect to leave your culture behind in order to be able to be accepted in a different society. And the expectation that it is much more for refugees, that they have to, you have to be grateful for the fact that we are giving you a place to live. Therefore, you have to assimilate to what we're doing. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to use that my authoritarian power and ask that question. We have spoken about refugees in the context of work and adults. I'm very curious about child and adolescent refugees, and how can we foster resilience amongst them? What are the different traits or characteristics that you see amongst child and adolescent refugees that you have worked with? If you have worked with them, is it different from adult refugees? Because I would imagine that it is different, especially because children are going through various developmental stages, and for them to jump from being a child to being an adult, taking care of responsibilities that they don't need to, that would need a special kind of willpower and psychological resilience that they would have to that they need. So I mean, this question is for anyone. Maybe we can have Roy maybe answer a few points based on that, and then anyone else, if you'd like to touch upon this topic, please feel free to answer.
Yeah, I will say that we work mostly with children and adolescents. I think one of the main things that we see different is a lot of anger and a lot of like so-called behavioral issues, but I think it's more lack of a lot of services and lack of a lot of needs that kids have that are not being met, and that's why we see so-called behavioral issues. So, for example, wetting the bed, selective mutism, so when children stop talking for a while after a traumatic experience. But as you said, I think the main thing is the role that they take on themselves. So all of a sudden being some sort of a parental child, taking care of the basic needs of the family, and also often speaking the local language better than the parents, and then integrating better than the parents, and that also creates a gap. So I think the way that it affects is mainly about the ambiguous loss. So it's about the change that children have in their life of something very structured and well known into this unexpected reality, and often being dependent on authorities. Yeah.
Is there anyone else? Have you worked with children and adolescent refugees before? Have you noticed anything particularly significant in the way of how they are handling these adversities? Yeah, Anna.
I can just say one sentence from the research I was helping organizing, that there is a significant difference between kids who were traveling with parents and kids who were divided. So of course, I mean, it's an obvious thing for everybody, but refugee kids that were both parents the whole way with them can be very fine. It doesn't have to be very, very bad experience. But this research I'm happy to share with you later on. It shows how important it is to limit the moments when the families are divided, how crucial it should be to limit those moments.
Yeah. Martha, yes.
I will add my thoughts on the side of access to the labor market and the implications to minors. One of the things that we see is that when the family or the main breadwinner of the family cannot access to work and cannot earn a sufficient income to, support the family unit, a lot of the times we see negative coping mechanisms, and most of these negative coping mechanisms end up affecting children. And how do we see this? First, obviously, child labor that tends to be very common amongst like refugee communities, especially when families cannot work. In these conditions, like very exploitative conditions for children in so many cases, like minding or these manufacturers of garments, because they have we will hear some companies say they have small fingers, so they can do some work that others can't, but it's like really exploitation. Obviously, we also see child marriage and forced marriage in so many cases. Some others we also see, especially for women and girls, sex for survival, even at a very young age. In some other contexts, we see that children, if there is a lot of insecurity on the community, they can be recruited by gangs or other criminal groups, taking advantage of their need and their vulnerable situation. And then the lack of education. You see a lost generation that doesn't have access to schooling and doesn't have that development that other kids, that any other kid will have. And a lot of the aspects that when we talk about resilience, we really need to talk about like allowing children to be children, allowing minors and teenagers to be teenagers. And for that, we need to support their parents and build a community that everyone is taking care of these minors so that they can really live up to their potential. And one of these things is like, obviously, access to education, access to protection, not the othering, and allowing them to have the resources to survive as well.
Yeah, I think one of the important things that one can definitely talk about is the access to education, and having this access to education itself is so empowering for children and adolescents. And I remember Parwana, the person Anya was talking about, how she was desperate to find a way for her to study. She wanted to study and she didn't have the facility, and like many other kids, it's the same, like in India as well. While Rohingya refugees do not get the same rights as Sri Lankan Tamil refugees or Tibetan refugees, and they don't have access to for a higher education. And again, it depends on the state government, but education plays such a huge role in the development of empowerment and fulfilling lives. I'm sure we can have this discussion go on for many more minutes, but I think it's time for us to go eat dinner, and for those joining us from India to go sleep. Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful panel. You've been amazing audience, amazing speakers, and I hope we will use this opportunity to stay connected and find a way to work with the refugees together. So you can follow everyone on social media, and for Emanuele, you can write to him on via email. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I hope to see you around very soon. And yeah, good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Everyone.